Hi, everyone. My name is Nasan Mahboubi. I am the director of the Penn project on the future of U.S.-China relations. And I just wanted to say some initial words about our project generally. We have all of our current fellows are in the audience here today, along with the 4 who are being foregrounded in this event. Just to give people a quick sense of our project, so the Penn project, the future of U.S.-China relations, is an initiative from the University of Pennsylvania where we're trying to contribute to policy discourse about China in the United States by elevating and amplifying next generation scholars and experts on China who apply to our project. It's a competitive process every year, and are asked to generate policy relevant ideas and actually concrete policy recommendations rooted in their specialized academic work. So we are both elevating next generation voices and bridging academic and specialized expertise into policy discussion. So above all, we just want to encourage people with that specialized knowledge, with that academic expertise, to think about how to make whatever they have to share relevant to policy audiences, and especially to encourage a new generation of really talented people to be involved in this kind of work.
You guys might remember it was only back in January when DeepSeek released its R1 model, right? That DeepSixed for at least a little while NVIDIA stock price, as well as a lot of the US equity market along with it. And that was hailed as a Sputnik moment, where a Chinese AI company was able to produce a model nearly on par with the frontier models coming out of the US, like from OpenAI and Google, et cetera. It was a wake-up call for a lot of people who thought that China was far, far behind on AI. That got a lot of attention, I think rightly so. It was also a moment of sort of national triumph over, export controls from the US. That was the sort of framing. But a few months after that was another Sputnik moment. In fact, maybe in some ways more important. BYD released or unveiled its megawatt charging capabilities that allowed for its EVs to be charged in minutes, essentially in the same amount of time it takes to fill a tank of gas for a traditional internal combustion engine car. And BYD was not the only one. A few Chinese companies now have claimed to have megawatt charging capabilities, in the same way that DeepSeek was not the only frontier model coming out of China. That now we have a whole slew, maybe half a dozen or more of world-class AI models coming from China. It isn't just megawatt charging. I would point out a whole host of cutting-edge developments coming out of Chinese EV space. We're talking about some of the fastest cars, like a Yangwang reaching almost 300 miles per hour as an electric vehicle land speed record. You have Xiaomi moving from consumer electronics to smartphones and launching its own electric vehicles at a time also when Apple was sort of cutting back its $10 billion bet on its own EV. You have right now a lot of Western, Japanese, Korean car companies worried about what this means not only for their sales in China, but globally, wondering how to handle this. You have Ford CEO traveling to China for the first time in a number of years after COVID, and realizing that their partner in China was ahead of Ford technologically. Build quality, handling, a lot of the basics that surprised someone who was clearly well-versed with the industry. And this actually generalizes beyond EVs, right? So China's now a leader in a whole range of clean tech industries. So batteries, obviously, solar, wind, now going into smart grid systems. A lot of these technologies are not only important for climate, for clean tech, but are the foundations for other emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles, autonomous systems, drones, the so-called low-altitude economy. I would highlight this as part of a set of intersecting megatrends, is how I would put it right now, where on the one hand you have the rise of especially Chinese dominance, not just in clean tech, but in sort of the entire supply chain. 70, 80, 90% of battery production, anodes, cathodes, the lithium processing, for example. Not to say anything of the whole solar supply chain, for example. And another megatrend is also this now effort by a lot of Chinese companies to go abroad, to expand and build factories like BYD is doing in Hungary, Thailand, Brazil, all over, even looking at India, for example. Another megatrend at the same time is just more broadly sort of China rising up in the value chain, now competing not just in automotive, but in biotech, or in industrial automation, industrial robotics. And at the same time, we have heightening US-China tensions, growing competition in a growing number of spaces, not just economic, but technological, obviously military, and so on. So what does this all mean? At the same time, there's an unfortunate trend in the US where there's sort of a backsliding of commitment to clean technology. The background mega trend is the climate crisis itself and the global energy transition, which the US, at least at the federal level, seems to not only be sort of pulling out of, but actively stymieing in the US with the blocking of the wind industry, for example. And this is happening at a time when China's taking the lead. So what should the US do about this? What should we do with respect to China? What should we do with respect to our own competitiveness in these areas? And I put forth a couple policy ideas that might be a little bit sort of blue sky, but I think are worth considering. One is to try to bring in actively through incentives, maybe, I know we're living in a sort of post-IRA age, but a lot of those efforts to bring in Japanese, Korean, and even, yes, Chinese clean tech investment into the United States, contingent on a host of data security and other sort of security issues. That's one set of factors. Some people might ask, like, would China be willing to do this? Why would they be willing to share technology? And I would argue that actually technology is much broader than just blueprints or licensed IP. There's a whole host of process knowledge, know-how that comes with having a factory, just like China had gained from previous automotive factories from the West and also from Tesla's Shanghai factory. I also recommend that the US invest in creating a special venture capital fund, a national venture capital fund that takes equity stakes in especially startups. So right now, China's not pausing on clean tech innovation. Battery companies like CATL and BYD are forging ahead on sodium ion, on sort of next-gen battery technology. We should be doing the same, and we should be putting government support towards that in a way that at least creates a sense of having a common stake for taxpayers and voters, so that they can see this connection between what government funds are going into and sort of the outcomes. And more broadly, this is sort of like not a policy recommendation, but there needs to be an attitude shift in trying to understand this growing differential in technological capabilities. And I think we can put our heads in the sand and believe that this is not happening and that China's not leading in these key areas, again, that are not just important for climate, but important for a bunch of emerging technologies. Or we can ask ourselves, how can we draw on some of this in a strategic way to build up our own capacity to compete, especially not just for the US market, but globally. So, thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Yingyi Ma. I'm a professor of sociology from Syracuse University, also a Brookings Fellow. And my research actually follows pretty logically from Kania's discussion about technology. There's so much attention placed on US-China competition on technology, but my argument, I've always tell people that the root of US-China competition, be it technology or politics or economics, is talent. That's how I really centered my research on. 10 years ago, I started researching this rising wave of Chinese students to the United States. I came here 25 years ago as a graduate student, fully funded by Johns Hopkins University. I just identified such an interesting trend that Chinese students more than 10 years ago came here not funded by American university anymore, like my generation has been, but funded by their parents. And I think that transition really speaks to a remarkable transformation that has happened within China. It's not just they're getting rich, but also the rising middle class or upper middle class, their dissatisfaction with the domestic education system in China and what they want for their children. So published a book 5 years ago, and it's called Ambitious and Anxious. Was translated into Chinese last year. That has naturally brought to my current project that I'm really interested in what has happened to them post-graduation, their transition to the global labor market. For the Penn project, I'm really focused on how the immigration policy, not just within the United States, but also elsewhere, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Japan, really affected the Chinese graduates' transition to the global labor market. So for this project specifically, I focused on H-1B visa policy. So one of my key findings, which surprised me as well, is that over much of the past decade, Chinese students only received 10 to 12% of all the H-1B visa recipients, despite they have been the largest group until 2024. So on average, they take at least 30% of the graduates, but they took about 10 to 12% of the visa. And that's number one. Number two is H-1B visa cap has not really been changed ever since 2005, 20 years ago. But since then, not just Chinese, but international graduates has been doubled, and Chinese students probably more than tripled and quadrupled. So the demand definitely outstrips supply. And so that leads to the current H-1B visa policy, which is, you all know, is based on lottery. And so one of my policy recommendations is the US should really train and retain them by shifting the lottery system to the merit-based system, much like the Canada's and Australia's point-based system. That not only right now, they're really trying to, have a salary threshold, which is something that is not very good because that's just disproportionately give visas to tech people and finance people. And we have talented people in arts, sociology, in architecture, who don't really make a lot of money. And it's not really eligible for those kinds of H-1B visa threshold. But it's going to be turned away by the new policy formation. I also advocate for a special category of US-trained H-1B visa category, which is not currently existing, that we should prioritize giving visas to those people who had American degrees, and we don't really have it for now. And lastly, H-1B visa needs employer sponsorship, and the top 3 employers are Amazon, which we probably all agree, or we can guess, and probably the other 2, who can guess? Facebook, Google, yes, that's all the guess. No, that's not the right answer. The 2 are offshore company in India. So that's something that's not really going against India, but really trying to diversify the H-1B visa sponsorship. I really advocate that US government should subsidize the small and medium-sized employer by giving them incentives to sponsor H-1B visa so that the visa is not going to be abused by certain offshore companies. And ultimately, it's going to benefit a lot of Chinese students who are trying to stay in the United States using their American credentials. I got some of the questions and pushback by saying that a lot of Chinese students want to return to China. Yes, but during the process of my research, there's a Day 1 CPT program that really shows a lot of Chinese students try to stay here in the United States and they've already got jobs, but they could not really get H-1B visa. So Day 1 CPT basically is they enroll in the school to keep their legal status afloat. And so I think that really illustrates there is a very strong demand for people who are trying to stay here. And Day 1 CPT is an extremely fascinating program. If people have not really heard about it, like when Americans trying to work to support their study, not just Chinese, a lot of Indians as well, international students are studying to support their work so that they can stay here legally. That's it for my discussion. I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, well, thanks so much. My name is Carl Minzner. I'm a professor of law at Fordham Law School in New York. I'm also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and my work sort of follows somewhat on ease, which is that I'm primarily focused on domestic politics. So I've written in the past about a range of party policies as well as social trends in China. And I can talk tonight about sort of one of the current things I'm working on, which is really about demography and party policy with respect to emerging demographic trend. And so I can start by sort of just pointing out something that many of you are already familiar with, which is that fertility rates and birth rates in China, just like in the rest of East Asia, are really plunging to among the lowest in the world. Current fertility rates in China are around 1, which is very low. Just like their counterparts, I mean, this of course isn't just unique to China, but the same thing has been true. This happened in Japan in the 90s, it happened in South Korea and Taiwan in the early 2000s. And at each point, authorities in those societies began to pivot towards pronatalism, government policies aimed at beginning to sort of encourage people to have children. Same thing's happening in China right now. Since the census in 2020, there's been a much more aggressive move by China to turn in this direction. And so one of the notable things that is happening, of course, is that China, which many of you or anyone's familiar with the story of the last 20 or 30 years, authorities in Beijing had very strong, coercive, anti-natalist policies, the one-child policies, and those have been abandoned. So starting in 2016, dropped in favor of a two-child policy, and then in 2021, in favor of a three-child policy. And more recently, in recent years, what you started to see is Chinese authorities begin to roll out additional slates of measures. So that includes lengthened parental leaves. It includes creation of more childcare, lots of efforts to create kindergartens. It also includes now explicit financial bonuses for having additional children. Some of these measures actually are somewhat laudable. They include, useful measures to try to help lower the barriers for prospective parents to have children by beginning to target or try to lower the financial and practical obstacles that might prevent people from having children. So some of these are actually good. They haven't actually had much of an effect. And again, just like in the rest of East Asia, other East Asian countries have rolled out many of these similar policies, and they really haven't altered their birth rates at all. And in fact, it's just a point at this moment to sort of emphasize how different, because many people, when they think of East Asia or China, they sort of think, well, it's all kind of generally similar with what's happening in the rest of the world. And here it's really important to underline how totally different East Asia is. If you're talking about the fertility rates in East Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and China are all now, like, China's around 1. The others are all under 1. South Korea is at 0.7. Macau is at 0.56. And so if you're somebody who's German, it's like, well, we're kind of a low birth rate society, like 1.6. No way. Italy and Japan around 1.2. You're in societies in the rest of East Asia where Japan looks positively fertile by comparison. So really, it's important to underline how different most of East Asia is compared to the rest of the world. The next point I'll emphasize is that faced with sort of these increasing difficulties, what Chinese authorities within the party are starting to do is to begin to pivot towards a more coercive, there are emerging signs of sort of a more coercive pro-natalist policy that's beginning to develop. So party language that was repeated in the past with regard to the need for gender equality, that's starting to become dropped. You're starting to see, approval rates for divorce in courts have fallen. And now you're starting to see the Jiwei, the population control apparatus in China, being repurposed. I mean, some of you guys look like you might be in the right age group where maybe friends of yours, start to receive calls, from folks kind of inquiring about, the possibility about, have you thought about looking into having children? This is, in an earlier era, it would have been calls about checking to make sure that people were not having children. Now it's like, well, have you thought about the possibility of having children? And for anyone who sort of remembers the one-child policy, I think this starts to raise some really interesting concerns about where could this go in China? Because I think people start to think, well, could you start to see more coercive measures that begin to impinge on the rights, the ability of women, the ability of, the free choice of people in terms of how many children to have. And so that's kind of one of the big issues that I'm sort of now thinking about. And of course here, one of the questions, well, what do we think about it and what do we do about it? And of course, from my standpoint, I'm like, women's rights are very important. And so this is a real big issue that people should be thinking about. But how do we think about it? And I'll just sort of give you like a couple thoughts. So one, I do think both for Americans, foreign policy officials who work on this stuff, but Chinese authorities as well, I do think it's really important to think about the differences between measures that are aimed at supporting the individual fertility choices, birth choices of people, helping people realize their own intentions, or not to have children. Some people may not be able to have children because of IVF, because of infertility and the like. So there's positive things that the state can do, not just in China, but elsewhere, in terms of helping people surmount those barriers. That, I would say, is a good thing. When it comes to sort of having fertility levels set as a designated state target where you're trying to manipulate them through policy intervention, I would say that's not such a good thing. And so that's sort of one argument at like a normative level, and you could throw in arguments about, women's rights and the importance of that. I would add to that there's a really, in talking to Chinese officials, I do think there's another really important thing to underline, which is that many of these policies, if you start to, you want to think about why fertility levels are so low in most of East Asia. And you want to realize that there are gender norms that are at work. I mean, you are seeing lots of young women opt out of marriage precisely because conservative gender norms, it's not just a question of expense or difficulty having children. That's a trend throughout the world. Marriage rates in South Korea have dropped by 45% in the last decade. Marriage rates in China have dropped by 55%. What's happening, and I'm virtually positive that all of you guys are watching trends on social media and there is some really serious stuff going on between young men and young women in China. And I can tell you, I've had conversations with the young men and the young women, not good. I mean, they're 20 and 30-year-olds that they're saying some interesting things about each other. But what particularly worries me about this dynamic is if you start adding a particular state campaign, begin to politicize family, marriage, and childbirth in an even stronger way than it is now, you could drive those rates even lower. And I would flag this as a concern, particularly in China, also in many other societies as well, perhaps including our own. And so I think this would be a crucial point to try to emphasize to the 24 men who are currently on the Politburo, that this is something that is, could have really serious implications for China's future in many ways, and that might be something to try to avoid. Thank you so much.
All right, good evening all. Well, first, I'm really happy and honored to be back at JF Books. The last time I was here, I bought as many books as I could carry, so that may be a danger tonight as well, but I wanted to expand the conversation to something even more dangerous, perhaps, and that is the defense and security issues that come into play with the rise of Chinese national power or comprehensive national power. So to try to tie some of these themes together, as we've seen the rise of S&T, the talent enabling these questions of demography and future power. This has profound implications for defense and security, especially in the context of cross-strait issues. And there's something of a contradiction in how we're hearing Chinese leaders talk about the trends that they see. On one hand, there are claims that unification in Beijing's parlance is inevitable given these trends in comprehensive national power, that this is ostensible optimism that sooner or later this desired end state will occur, thereby enabling China's national rejuvenation. At the same time, as we heard in Beijing this summer, there's this deepening pessimism about the near-term outlook in terms of trends in Taiwan's politics, public opinion, society, that more and more averse to Beijing's desired end state of unification. And from the perspective of US policy and our commitment to peaceful resolution within the constraints of sort of strategic ambiguity as the current concept that characterizes a lot of our debates, this raises some challenging questions when we see the intersection of sort of that pessimism, this exacerbation of cross-strait tensions in recent years. Can trace some of these trends back to 2022, where with the rise of China's power has become a greater capacity to use military power for coercive purposes. And we're starting to see, juxtaposed with that pessimism about political trends, growing optimism about the cross-strait military balance. And I find that troubling, as we've seen since 2022, a dramatic expansion of PLA, People's Liberation Army posture and presence in vicinity of Taiwan. And as China pursues an innovation-driven development strategy at the national level, through a grand strategy of, so to speak, of military-civil fusion, many of these emerging technologies can also be adopted and integrated for military purposes in ways that do further alter this military balance across the strait and also between the US and China. So when I hear or see assessments from Chinese military scholars and officers that they see the era gap between the US and Chinese militaries as closing. They see growing opportunity or reasons to believe that their strategy of developing counter-intervention capabilities to offset US military power is on course for success, and a tendency to dismiss or regard as negligible Taiwan's own self-defense capabilities. I think this raises some very deep concerns for US policy. The focus of my project has really been grappling with these trends and these issues as somebody who's been looking at how the Chinese military thinks about the future of warfare for over a decade now, and sort of seeing how the initial speculation about dating back to AlphaGo in 2016, what might AI mean for the future of military power and command decision-making, to lately the DeepSeek moment and the craze for using LLMs in all things, including potentially military planning, intelligence, and decision-making. So we're sort of seeing a convergence of these trends, of this complex politics, diplomacy, cross-strait relations, with this growth and expansion of the sharpest element of China's national power, that of the military, as we saw on display at the recent parade, and a growing willingness to use it. And this notion that Xi Jinping has promoted of peacetime employment of military capabilities linked to concepts of cognitive domain operations, of this pressure campaign against Taiwan. There's a lot of talk in this town about 2027, and I guess I'll say I think that there are reasons to be concerned about the near term, about the fact that Chinese leaders have made very clear that this is a symbolic anniversary for the PLA. It's a milestone by which they want the Chinese military to be capable of undertaking an invasion of Taiwan to compel unification through force, and I think that is concerning whether or not we believe the PLA is on track to meet that milestone, given recent anti-corruption campaigns and losses or disappearances of certain senior leaders in the military sphere. That is another question and debate. But I think the intentions have been clear, the threats have been clear, and I think the question is way forward for US policy and how we grapple with these trends from the perspective of our commitment to Taiwan, our commitment to peaceful resolution, and our overriding concerns with peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. So I don't think I've resolved any of these questions in my policy paper so far, but a couple of initial thoughts I've been trying to think through and work through this week in our conversations back here in DC have been along the lines of, first, how do we ensure that US security cooperation and defense engagement with Taiwan is impactful and actually impacts Chinese perceptions of the military balance in ways that can be stabilizing and reinforce deterrence. So that would mean, for instance, overcoming the recent backlog in arms sales and making sure that foreign military sales are focused on capabilities with maximal efficacy, accelerating the delivery of emerging and asymmetric capabilities to Taiwan, informed by the right lessons learned from Ukraine. So that's definitely a piece of this, and that is perhaps an obvious thing to say, but more challenging to do, especially when we've seen some of the sort of systemic problems and debates around sort of how the security cooperation piece and use of mechanisms like foreign military sales and presidential drawdown authority have been playing out in practice. Which is why my second recommendation is thinking about metrics. How do we measure what is and isn't working in the context of this US-Taiwan partnership? Which efforts are most effective? And looking at it from the perspective of how this shapes Beijing's calculus and thinking. There's some debates on occasion about, is there a greater risk of doing too much or too little? Should we be more worried about deterrence or about that too active engagement could spur Beijing to see a window of opportunity closing? At this point, I'm more concerned about a failure of deterrence, given the combination of near-term pessimism about political trends, growing optimism about the military balance, and the idea that Xi Jinping, unlike previous generations of Chinese leaders, isn't willing to delay indefinitely the achievement of unification in his parlance, which he sees as integral to national rejuvenation. So whether we're talking about 2027 or 8, 9, the 2030s, I think our time horizons are ambiguous, but I do worry we're heading towards, at the very least, a crisis, whether we call this gray zone or coercion or sort of use of military force in these cognitive domain operations. I think we need to think seriously about, and this leads to my third recommendation, of how do we improve a coordination with our partners, both with Taiwan and with other allies in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and beyond. And how do we also continue to think about some of these informational dimensions of our strategy? How do we both message from the perspective of deterrence, but also continue to, where necessary, reassure Beijing that fundamentally US policy on Taiwan hasn't changed. The most dramatic change has been PLA power, posture, presence, and pressure. So as we try to respond to those trends, I think it's important to continue this conversation with our allies and partners and these debates on how do we align our policy to be effective and ultimately stabilizing. So I will stop there for now. I'm very much looking forward to the questions and conversation. Excited to continue the discussion tonight and beyond.
All right. Of course, I want to watch the military parade. And there is a comment I have seen, and I personally very agree, is that if you are really strong, you don't need to constantly show your muscle. Mm-hmm. So I want to see what's your response. Thank you.
Say it's a great question, and I think there is something of a contradiction. On one hand, we're seeing these seemingly impressive displays of Chinese military power. At the same time, I think there is an underlying anxiety or insecurity that the PLA is a force that is self-critiques itself as suffering from peace disease. They're untested in conflict in their modern history. There are concerns about the capabilities and proficiency of their commanders, that human capital and talent piece in a military context is critical as well. So I think, as somebody who tries to assess and right-size our understanding of Chinese military power and the implications, I see a lot of tendency both to overestimate and underestimate the PLA. Some will point to the parade and say that the PLA is 10 feet tall or is sort of already leading the world in all of these emerging domains and capabilities and the drones on display and the new missiles and the like. And then others will say, well, the PLA, they can't fight, not unlike the Russian military, they could crumble in an actual conflict. And I tend to think, and perhaps an obvious thing to say, but the reality is somewhere in the middle. We don't know exactly where, and nor do Chinese leaders necessarily. So as they are pursuing these cognitive domain and pressure operations in vicinity of Taiwan, they are in some sense are rehearsing or simulating, they are validating, can their capabilities perform as expected in this environment? Can their commanders handle the pressure even just in a peacetime competitive environment? And I think some of these questions are unanswerable in peacetime. I hope we never know or see for sure how much that hardware translates into capability and operational effectiveness. I think it's a topic that I think merits a lot of continued scrutiny and critical thinking, because we don't want to buy into the propaganda that the PLA is as powerful as they portray themselves are, nor do we want to underestimate the real threat they pose.
One of the biggest contributors to China's rise has been the ability to do reverse engineering at scale. This is not just through industrial espionage, it's through actual reverse engineering efforts. What can you say among your policy verticals have contributed to China's ability to do this at scale? And what policies can the US also do that are similar to what China has done?
One thing that I think is not talked about that much and that I hope to emphasize in my book is, like, they have a whole chapter on this, is investment in basic science and research, and how that laid a technical foundation for being able to, so-called absorb technology from abroad. And I think this is something, China's not the only country that has tried to have sort of state-directed development, industrial policy, especially not the first developing country to try to do this. Other countries have done tariffs, protective measures, tried to have joint ventures. Many of the major economies across the global south have tried to do this. But I think where China has been successful is when they've laid that scientific foundation to begin with. And so I think, how is China able to get into polysilicon production so quickly? I think some of that was a foundation in solar technology, in semiconductor technology leading up to that helped kind of lay that. Another big factor is also these overlapping industries. So, the rise of Chinese EVs is built on a huge, in fact, the world's largest traditional automotive industry before that. And that was built with those, JVs, for example, but also parts, right? So the largest automotive parts industry. So those can feed into other future industries and kind of, again, provide like most of the puzzle pieces, and then you might be missing a few components like the batteries, like the power control systems, motor control units, things like that come later. But I think what's often ignored when people look at like a particular industry and how China has been successful is all the adjacent sort of knowledge and know-how industrial capability that kind of enabled that success?
Great question. I think reverse engineering in scale is China's unique advantage. America cannot reproduce, honestly. What is America's advantage? America has the structural advantage that China cannot reproduce. It's its immigration system. Its unique power to attract the talent from the rest of the world. And I think America right now is intentionally or unintentionally compromising that. Yes, China still has foreigners living in China and has certain soft power, but it's no comparison with the United States. There is interesting comparisons. People are talking about, China model innovation and America model innovation. It's like America is from 0 to 1. America is, really creating things, and China is really from 1 to 100. It's like, scale things up and doing those kinds of reverse engineering, as you said. But I think what is really behind it, as I said, is talent. China has so many engineers, and Chinese college students have majored in engineering at so much of a higher frequency than Americans have ever done. And that's fundamentally really underscores the need that America technology sector, much to the surprise and sometimes ignorance of US politicians, is that they need foreign talent because the sector could not really have enough engineers from its domestic education system. And yes, NSF always pours into millions and billions of money into STEM education in the US. But still, it takes a long time. It's a long-standing issue, and people are saying that doing science is sexy in China, but never in the United States. And I think that cultural difference really underscores the huge talent differences, how many degrees you really produce. We're not really talking about the quality of it, but sometimes to have that kind of reverse engineering scale, you need the quantity of engineers to really produce that.
First, full support for what Yingyi said about immigration. I'll just note that sort of China, some of my research is more broadly focused on broader demographic trends. Chinese authorities themselves are right now they've just introduced a new visa category for young foreigners with technical experience, basically trying to kind of play around possibly with getting what basically decades, if not 100+ years in the United States, is kind of already established as a trend in the United States, just inflow of talented people. So full support that the United States has got its own skills. The other part I would add is just I do think that in this narrative about China's plans, people forget exactly how bad things are. What you're talking about when people are talking about the highly educated individuals, you're talking primarily about urban educated elite. If you're looking at the Liushou Ertong, if you're looking at the left behind children, there is policies of institutional exclusion that create very different realities for well over half the population. China's rural plus migrant. It's a very different situation. So remember that sometimes the plan itself, mass, emphasis on scale, et cetera, there can be sort of the other side, which is, you create a lot of massive overproduction of college graduates. You've got some pretty serious youth unemployment issues right now in China. You've got other issues in terms of where the resources that are being channeled into, major urban. And on the outside in the United States, we look at it and think, oh, this is all a great success. China is grappling with its own consequences of what it's dealing with, just hopefully as the United States grapples. We both have our own strengths and benefits. We have to grapple with our own problems. But sometimes I think the discussion in the United States kind of overlooks some of the reality of what China has its problems to.
I would just add in the military domain as well. In the US context, we all often focus on invention, innovation, originality. And when it comes to operational effectiveness, the capacity to diffuse and scale capabilities matters more than who came up with the idea in the first place. So if DARPA launches a great program and then the PLA might decide to emulate it and might be able to scale it up and implement it more quickly and start to field these capabilities, that perhaps matters more than who should get credit for the origination of the idea. So I think often we tend to focus very much on innovation, but I think it is the diffusion and realization of those capabilities at scale that matters much more in terms of the military balance as well. And I think we see this play out in industrial policy too, that sort of having cutting edge technology and being at the cutting edge doesn't matter tremendously in terms of your long-term growth and national power unless you can really leverage and exploit that to the fullest.
Whether the cultural memory of the one-child policy, whether its promotion or its enforcement, has shaped how the older generation encourages or disincentivizes the younger generation to have kids or not.
You get in China right now, you've got a generation of people who sort of, grew up in an era in which, you weren't supposed to have that many children, and all of a sudden the younger generation is being encouraged to have that. That is somewhat of a head-spinning shift. I'll push back a little bit because I do think that there's a narrative, particularly because people want to write newspaper stories and it's all about, well, because of the one-child policy, China now faces low birth rates. And I think it's really important to emphasize a couple of things. The drop-off in fertility wasn't specifically the result of the one-child policy. It started originally in the 70s, the longer, later, fewer campaigns, so there was a drop-off there. And secondly, it really isn't just China. It's paralleling stuff that's happening throughout East Asia. So yes, in China there is this feature where you're coming off of 30 years of tough population controls. But there's something much deeper going on too. And of course, one big part of that story is something that's similar throughout the world, which is, having children is expensive. There's a lot of other competing demands on people's time. People want to overinvest. I mean, you've got pressures for getting your kids into college, and therefore you're going to throw all of your energy into having one. And by God, that if you're the person who's the primary caregiver, that's a huge investment of time. The mothers or sometimes fathers who are the responsible for organizing the bushiban classes and stuff. It's a huge hit on your own personal life, and particularly in societies, South Korea, I won't just mention China, but South Korea, amount of housework that women do compared to amount, it's just vastly different. And so there are a particular set of pressures across a range of societies, including China, driving fertility rates low. I do think when you're thinking about the dynamic in China in particular, or East Asia in particular, it is also really important to keep people's eye on the idea that there is something going on within individuals themselves, but also among people coupling up. In East Asia, having children out of wedlock is exceptionally unusual. And consequently, if people don't get married, they don't have children. And so there's a much broader story going on in which young people are opting out of marriage and opting out of the entire package of having children, partially because of the burden of having children, partially because there's also some very complicated dynamics going on between young men and young women, particularly young women basically saying, I'm not going to sign up for X. There's gender stuff, really complicated gender things that are going on. That's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, the one-child policy itself is a component, but there's a broader story that's going on. And Chinese authorities themselves really thought in the late 2010s, we just relaxed the one-child policy. We allow people to have as many as they want. It's going to just bounce back up. Did not happen. And it's now spiraling down. It would not surprise me that China sort of ends up eventually starting to compete with South Korea in terms of going to the lowest of the low. And that has some really interesting implications for Chinese society when you start looking forward 20, 30 years in the future.
What role does increasing Taiwanese identity play into U.S. and China relations?
My impression from conversations with Chinese scholars who focus on Taiwan politics and cross-strait issues during our trip to Beijing, and I'm trying to frame and scope this narrowly because we were there at a unique moment in time around the time that Lai's Shijiang, the 10 speeches were starting, so there was a rather dramatic reactions we were observing from many of our interlocutors. But I think the sort of sense of Taiwanese identity provoking this prevailing pessimism I described among Chinese scholars who work on cross-strait issues, who are concerned that political pathways to peaceful unification, so to speak, might be closed off by that growing sense of identity and the associated changes in public opinion. U.S. policy is committed to peaceful resolution. Questions of Taiwanese identity are inherently an issue of Taiwan politics and society. I don't feel that I can really comment on that personally, but I think it does impact U.S.-China relations. What was described to me in one case as sort of a loss of optimism, even a loss of hope, that there were purely peaceful pathways through economic and other political incentives, which I think is what's driving some of this coercion and a doubling down on military pressure in terms of PRC policy and posture towards Taiwan, even as that continues to backfire and often intensify the sense of Taiwanese identity and inclination towards resistance. There do appear to be several scholars or a few voices remaining in Beijing who are continuing to advocate for cross-strait dialogue or focus on integrated development and economic incentives and sort of more peaceful pathways. But when I hear a definition of peaceful that includes measures like a blockade and quarantine, I do worry that, or anything short of missiles launched against Taipei, I worry that sort of there is a hardening of views in Beijing on the question of Taiwan that is not unrelated to PRC perceptions of Taiwanese identity as a threat to their preferred outcome of unification. Hopefully there are some pathways. I hope that those in Beijing involved in these conversations will have the self-awareness and reflection to recognize that certain elements of their policies are counterproductive and sort of reinforcing trends and tendencies that are adverse to Beijing's ostensible strategic objectives, and I hope that there can be some kind of political off-ramps or even willingness from Beijing for some kind of dialogue with the current administration on the DPP side, though that may seem unlikely in the current context. But I mean, identity in these trends in society and political tendencies do have a role on the overall stability, but ultimately, US policy is centered on peaceful resolution, and ultimately this is a question for Taiwan and for the Chinese people overall to resolve.
I guess if you look at, say, Chinese government venture capital, which is like a huge kind of space right now, one key thing about it is it's very important for venture capital or entrepreneurial finance in general to have risk appetite. But Chinese government venture capital just doesn't have the risk appetite. Like the government is way too risk averse to do any kind of investments that's actually good for innovation. With the kind of election kind of pressure and everything, do you think the US states has the kind of risk appetite to do good venture capital? What do you think about kind of the export control and also the kind of deterrence policies the US government is doing in the technology space? And also, what is the end state of deterrence?
So on the venture capital front, so I think the way that China's gone about it actually has a lot of problems and isn't working quite as well as was originally designed. I think you're right to point out that a lot of the people managing these government guidance funds, we're very conservative. We're worried about making a mistake in investment and being on the hook personally. Also, it didn't crowd in private investment in the way that they had originally hoped. In many ways, like it comes with the companies that get this investment, it comes with a lot of strings. It comes with additional risks themselves. And actually, I mean, it's kind of funny because I do remember talking with people involved with the CHIPS Act. There's almost needs to be like a premium to the government investment because of the strings that come along with taking investment, oversight, all those sort of normal things. So, but how could the U.S. do better, perhaps, or why could it do it any differently? One thing that I do think is interesting to think about is the politics of a venture capital fund. Because yes, of course, people point out, rightly that it could be subject to sort of interest groups lobbying to get funding. It could sort of like dilute the sort of profit motive and kind of like distort commercial operations. These are all real risks. I think about the other side of this, which is just kind of like the cultural resonance of like of a VC fund, and the way that for loan guarantees or sort of traditional U.S. style industrial policy or states, there's too little risk tolerance because people are afraid of wasting taxpayer money. They're afraid of another Solyndra, another high-profile bankruptcy or failure that shows that the government can't pick winners. And the point is not really to pick specific winners, but to kind of push capital across an emerging sector that needs it badly, especially in order to bridge that sort of valley of death to commercial viability. So here, I think the VC idea is interesting. Who knows how much sort of political viability it has, but I think it's interesting just in the way that it changes our mindset, like the mindsets of American voters and taxpayers in terms of like, okay, this is not like a handout. This is not like a free piece of money that's given away and then you hope for the best, but that it's like a stake, an ownership stake, sort of like future innovation or something like that, and has that kind of risk appetite resonance that Silicon Valley VC funds famously have. So the association could be tenuous, but I'm sort of like banking on this idea that we need to change our perception about risk taking. On the export control front, I'm working on a piece right now. The thesis is that one of the central motivating factors behind a Chinese industrial policy is the US. That many of our actions, and to be clear, many times our actions are a response to Chinese actions, like military escalation around the strait. But overall, you get the cycle of response. And I do think that things like the export controls on Huawei and the semiconductor export controls push Huawei into becoming a chip champion now in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. That yes, while there was an underlying long-term push to build up greater self-reliance across a whole bunch of strategic industries in China, so people will, critics of my argument might say like, well, China was going to do this anyways. I would say like, yes, but it shifts the balance of the trade-offs and pushes it in favor of really bringing the whole supply chain domestically and really sort of accelerating this effort. So I think we have to think, when we're thinking about export controls, I'm not against export controls, like, don't get me wrong. I think we have to think about where they might be useful, for how long, what are the second and maybe even third order effects, in what ways might we be stimulating certain parts of China's industrial policy efforts while stymieing others, right? And what is the net impact? So, it's a complicated answer, but I think it's a complicated problem. And I don't think that we've thought about it in a fully sort of holistic way up until now. Yeah, thank you.
Where do you think US-China relations will be in 10 years' time? What will the world look like and why?
I mean, okay, here, I'll start, because this isn't related to demographics, but my first book was really on sort of China's political evolution and sort of a descent into sort of, the story that I was telling there was institutional erosion, where sort of a one-party state, increasing economic distress, increasing ideological hardening, and sort of a pivot back towards one-man rule. It really was a story of institutional erosion that was going on in China. And I am still very pessimistic about where that leads China. I think it leads to bad decision making. I think it exacerbates certain social economic inequalities. I think it actually does contribute to political radicalization at some point, particularly among young people who start to feel like they don't have any future. That's a story about China. I think you could tell that story about the United States too. And so that's a situation where it's a different story, but it's not exact. Systems are very different. But I am seriously worried about this particular moment where you could tell the same story about political erosion, you could tell the same story about social radicalization, unfortunately, after events today, and economic problems. I mean, my generation is the generation, I was born in the 70s, I'll out myself as how old I am. But I mean, we grew up in a very different era in the United States from many of you who are much younger than me. Look, you guys are in DC, this is sort of, this is a more elite crowd, but there are people in the United States for whom the narrative you hear about China today is kids are waking up and realizing my life isn't going to be as good as my parents. And that's just starting to happen, and there's a realization, and there's like discontent that's starting to happen there. In the United States, that process has been going on for a little bit longer. And so there are some real risks to both societies, and I'm worried about both of them for kind of similar reasons. And so that's just a story about each of those two countries individually. But what particularly worries me is you could easily imagine a situation in which discontented both individual societies start to feed into some very distressing trends, and they interact in bad ways. So I'm very worried about this. And my hope is that it's also people start realizing, oh yeah, they've got their own problems over there too, instead of just externalizing all the stuff that's like you're unhappy about your own society. You start realizing like actually trends that are going on that are broader than just it's all the other guy's fault. I'm pessimistic and worried. I wish I could create a better narrative, but hopefully you guys are all going to be part of the solution.
I can follow Carl because I share Carl's worry. I'll talk a little bit beyond my area of expertise. Because I feel like as long as the area that Elsa is working on, the Taiwan area, the Taiwan issue, cross-strait relationship is stabilized, even though it's tenuous, but it's stable. I think U.S.-China relations in the next 5 to 10 years will be stable. Back and forth, export control, retaliation, back retaliation, but still stable. But if the Taiwan issue is not really going well, we're going to be really, really bad. That's just my prediction.
I have a darker answer, which is I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned about a downward spiral. That we are in this moment where, yeah, okay, things feel stable. Things feel okay, maybe there's a trade truce, but I think we forget how tenuous this all is and how just a few months ago there was this tit-for-tat escalation that was so incredible, stretching far beyond tariffs, but entering into Chinese student visas, possible actions on U.S. companies, on And that's just scratching the surface. I mean, the kinds of export controls that both countries can do on each other, the kinds of damage that we can do to each other's supply chains, access to basic food, pharmaceutical ingredients, like a lot of the basic things that we take for granted. Even though I focus on things like industrial policy, which probably have like a longer term sort of arc to it, we can't fully wrap our heads around. It's a little bit like a COVID moment, in other words. Today we're sitting here, things feel normal, but I don't think we can even imagine what a true full-scale military conflict between the US and China looks like, and how devastating that would be. So sorry to be the downer of all this. This is not even my area per se, like military, so this is Elsa. But this is what I really, really, really worry about.
E-book project.
I guess that's my cue to pile on the pessimism,
Right,
or
right.
should I just stop right there? But I guess I would say, great question. Would love to hear your answer on this, because I do think we're in a moment where elite politics and presidential decision making may have immense consequences in shaping the trajectory of the bilateral relationship on both sides. But with regard to the cross-strait dynamic, I am deeply concerned, but trying to cling to a glimmer of optimism, because a best case scenario is muddling forward with some kind of status quo. No one really agrees on what that status quo is exactly and who is changing it. Is the change in the status quo PLA presence around Taiwan? Is it Lai Ching-de's political rhetoric? We're sort of entering into something of a vicious cycle where each side believes they are responding in a way that is justified and proportional, but we're seeing this sort of intensification of military pressure from the PLA that exacerbates threat perceptions, understandably, in Taipei and Washington, that the PLA's intentions, or CCP's intentions that the PLA is called upon to carry out, are to be prepared and postured for an invasion. And I hope that deterrence can hold. I hope there's a pathway for some reassurance where necessary as well, that there are some political off-ramps, or at least mechanisms for dialogue and stability. But I worry greatly about misperception, whether in a political context, misperception of signals, or misperception of the military balance. Because fundamentally, every conflict occurs because of some kind of miscalculation, or perhaps overconfidence on one side. Often, I mean, war is in the air term, so to speak, for any fellow academics in the room, and security studies and otherwise. So I hope we can stabilize this dynamic. I hope that there are positive trajectories going forward, but I think a lot will depend on leadership and on having some kind of mechanisms to mitigate misperceptions that could otherwise become dangerous, such as if Xi Jinping believes the PLA is actually prepared, that the US would not intervene and that the military balance is in their favor. I think if we can avoid those kinds of judgments or perceptions, that would be preferable, but I think that'll depend a lot on sort of leadership on both sides and having sort of clarity in communications. But I will stop there before I get into any deeper pessimism. I think the rest of the panel's already...
Thank you again. This was really wonderful. And thank you for the amazing questions.
Yes.